I'd like to next invite to the podium another one of our invited speakers, Professor Juan, who's the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan, which is also the best state in America. Professor Cole has devoted his career to understanding the Middle East and the Muslim world more generally, and to critically evaluating its relationship with the North Atlantic states. His most recent book is a translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Among his other recent works are Muhammed, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires, and The New Arabs, How the Millennial Generation is Changing the Middle East. He has translated works of Lebanese-American author Khalil Gibran, and he has appeared widely on media, including PBS NewsHour, ABC World News Tonight, Nightline, The Today Show, Anderson Cooper 360, Rachel Maddow, Chris Hayes All In, CNN, The Colbert Report, Democracy Now!, and many others. He has written about Egypt, Iran, Iraq, the Gulf, and South Asia, and about both extremist groups and peace movements. He is the proprietor of the Informed Comment News and Analysis site. He also conducts his research in Arabic, Persian, and Urdu and Turkish, as well as several European languages. He knows both Middle Eastern and South Asian Islam. He has lived in various parts of the Muslim world for more than a decade and continues to travel widely there. He has written, edited, or translated 21 books and over 100 articles and chapters. One thing I appreciate about Professor Cole is that, as we can see, though he's such a brilliant and accomplished and meticulous scholar, he's always had his pulse, his finger on the pulse of society. I think in academia it's easy to sort of retreat into an ivy tower and wash your hands of what is going on in the world and the dynamics of the community you live in, and Professor Cole has always been engaged in the community. So please help me welcome him to the podium.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you so much for this kind invitation to speak. It's wonderful to be here among you and to have this opportunity to celebrate the Prophet Muhammad in an interfaith context. You'll have to give me just a moment because the technology here has hoisted me by my own petard. I ordinarily have the computer in front of me, and so that I can see the same slide you're seeing. However, we can make this work as well. If we could have the first slide, please. The purpose of showing you these verses from the Quran is to underline that in the scripture that Muslims believe came from God through the Prophet, the values of religion and family are both present, but are in some ways distinct. I believe that the Quran says that we have obligations of family which are beyond our obligations of religion and don't always exactly intersect with them. In this verse, where it says, treat parents well, if one or both of them lives into old age with you, do not speak rudely to them and do not reproach them. Let the words you speak to them be noble. Lower before them the wing of submission out of compassion, and say, my Lord, have mercy on them, since they raised me when I was small. Your Lord knows best what is in your souls. Be righteous, and so forth. So this verse is talking about one's obligations, and it goes on to talk about further obligations to not only to the parents, but also to other relatives, but then to non-relatives, to strangers, to travelers, and that we have an obligation to take care of these others, both our relatives and strangers, although not to the extent that we would go broke doing it. The Quran is a very level-headed document and wants to avoid extremes. But what's interesting to me here is this idea of lowering one's wing in compassion to one's parents. So it's not saying that you should go along with them because they're right. It's saying you should go along with them because you have compassion for them, because they took care of you when you were helpless. Next slide, please. But there's an exception in the Quran to this obedience to parents. And that is, it says, we have counseled the people to be good to their parents, if those, parents that is, strive, however, to convince you to partner me with others of which you have no knowledge, do not obey them. So this is a verse in the voice of God. And God is addressing us all and saying, yes, be nice to your parents, do good for your parents. But there's one area where you just have to part ways. And that area is if your parents are pagans and they believe in multiple deities and they want to impress upon you that faith in deities beyond the one God. And in that sense, the prophet says, well, you have to resist them. You have to say, no, I can't go along with you. I can go this far, but no further. One of the interesting things about this verse is that it's showing you that in the early Muslim community, and if one thought about it, it would be obvious, but one doesn't often think these things, that the families were multi-religious. So there would be some members of the family who were still with the old pagan religion, worshiping various gods and goddesses. There would be some maybe younger people, and I think probably especially women, who were early adopters of the prophet's message. And they had to live in the same family. And family, I joke with my undergraduates when I try to explain Middle Eastern family to them. And I ask them, how many of them, if you say you really got in trouble, you needed a car to get to college, to your classes, but your car completely broke down, it's totaled, and you need $5,000 car loan to get a used car to come to college with. I asked them, I said, how many of you could get at least some of that loan from a first cousin? And out of a class of 50, maybe 8 will raise their hands. I said, you guys know what family is in a Middle Eastern sense, the rest of you have no idea. So these families are very central to people's lives, and they do things for one another. But here in this case, the Quran is talking about a fissure within the family between people who have embraced monotheistic religion and people who have stuck with the old ways. And so in that sense, in that case, the children are allowed to defy their parents. It's the only case that the Quran mentions where it's all right to tell your parents, no, I can't do what you're asking. Next slide, please. And in this slide, the principle is further given. It's similar in some ways that, your parents deserve to be treated well, and you should express thanks to them. But if they try to get you to believe in these other alien deities, you have to tell them no. But it goes on to say that nevertheless, having told them no, it's not a deal breaker for the relationship. You should go on consorting with them, associating with them, sahib homa. This word is nowadays in contemporary Arabic, it's one of the words for friend. So, in many families, and I have seen it in my own extended family, sometimes you get to a point with a family member, an aunt or a cousin, where you just can't see that person anymore. They cut each other off. They shun each other. And the Quran is advising against this custom. My family is mostly German Americans, and there have been disputes in the family occasionally that have caused people to stop talking with one another. They would sometimes come to the same event, but they just wouldn't talk. The Quran is saying, no, that's not how you should behave with your parents or other relatives, and that even if, in this extreme case, where you think they're going to hell, because people who are in the Quran, people who worship multiple gods, who don't acknowledge the one God, who have had it explained to them that there's just one God and that it's dangerous to the soul to rush here and there after the pagan deities. And we don't know very much about, from a historical point of view, the religious practices in North Arabia at this time. But we do have some record of, from the archaeology and from inscriptions, of people worshiping goddesses, and of identifying one of the Arabian goddesses, Al-Uzza, with Athena or Venus of the Romans. And so there may have been licentious kinds of worship involved in worshiping those goddesses, something that from the point of view of the Abrahamic religions, from the point of view of the Quran, was just incompatible with piety. And so even in this case where you have a relative who's being stubborn and won't listen to this message, that's not a reason to cut them off. You're supposed to continue to consort with them beyond the religious considerations as human beings, as people with whom you have this relationship, whether of blood or of marriage contract. And this became known in later Muslim thought as continuing to keep that connection of the womb, silatul rahm. And it's a very important principle in the Quran. I have to tell you that as I got into this research, I was a little bit surprised by some of the implications of what I'm finding, because when you read the Quran, it's full of these thunderous denunciations of paganism, and it's full of very, nightmarish. The Quran spares no language in describing the tortures of the netherworld were one to live an impious life. And yet to have it come back and talk about compassion and kindness and friendship with those pagans who are one's relatives, it seems to me quite striking and not an image that we often consider. And of course, one of the reasons that I'm talking about this is that I think that the principle has some implications of an ethical sort of a universal nature, which is to say, it's saying that don't let ideology get in the way of being a proper human being. And we've seen in our own society so many of these kinds of divisions where, again, people will cut one another off, most recently over politics. Politics is important, but it's not as important as the fate of your eternal soul. And the Quran is saying that even where you think somebody has gone that wrong in life and is facing that kind of spiritual peril, your everyday human interaction with that person should remain friendly and compassionate. And so I think it's saying that even if somebody is supporting the political party that you don't agree with, or a political leader that you don't agree with, you should keep that compassion and that relationship with them. And if you start to think about it, this is one of the secrets of Islam's success as a world religion, because most Muslims in history have not lived in majority Muslim societies. That's been an artifact of fairly recent centuries. Most Muslims in history were isolated traders in Indonesia among Buddhists and Hindus and animists. They were in India among Hindus. They were in the first probably 600 or 700 years of Islamic history. The Christians in the Near East were probably a majority in those societies, in Egypt and Syria and so forth. It took a very long time for people to ultimately embrace Islam. And so the Quran is full of wisdom for dealing with the other, and especially with the other to whom one has a relationship of kin. So this is also underlined in another verse. Next slide, please. Does this one say loving kindness at the top? Yeah. Say, I solicit no remuneration from you for it, save the loving kindness owed to relatives. So this is a kind of sentiment that recurs in the Quran, that God tells the Prophet Muhammad, tell these people who are carping about your message, because his message was poorly received among the elite of the Hijaz. Tell these people who are carping at you about your message. Well, it's not as if I'm like asking you anything for it. This is like free advice, guys. You take it, you don't take it, that's up to you. I'm not trying to make money here. But in this one verse, there is one exception. The prophet is saying, I'm not asking you for anything, except what I have a right to ask you for as kinsmen, as relatives. So it's implied that the relatives are not they're not absolved of responsibility to act like relatives towards the prophet just because he's giving them this message they don't like. And it's the other side of what the earlier verses were saying about the obligations that Muslims owe their non-Muslim relatives. It's saying that also those non-Muslim relatives have obligations to the Muslims. And they're not obligations that can be set aside on grounds of differences about religion. Next slide, please. So this is another one that reinforces this sentiment: give to your relatives what is by right owed to them, as well as to the poor and the traveler. That is best for those who seek the countenance of God, and they will be crowned with success. This verse implies that one of the things that's owed to relatives is charity, that helping out with that car loan. It's saying to people that, maybe it's a little difficult to help out the relatives. People are straitened in their circumstances. But remember, you'll go and take a loan to buy something. And if you take a loan on a $300,000 house, you'll end up paying $600,000 for it for over 30 years, right? The Quran is reminding people of that time who were paying interest on their loans, and often exorbitant interest. It's saying that you're willing to do that. You're willing to pay out this interest, but if you gave that money as charity instead of giving it as interest, your spiritual rewards would be great. And of course, if you pay the money in interest, you get nothing for it. Next slide, please. This verse from the Surat An-Nisa, the chapter of women, says, serve God and associate nothing with him. Be kind to parents, close relatives, to orphans and the needy, and to the neighbor who is related to you, and to the neighbor who is a stranger. It's very interesting to me the way the Quran mixes these obligations. It starts out by talking about the obligations of family. And I think that's not a hard sell. I think most people understand they have obligations of family. Then the Quran slips in these other people, orphans, people you don't know, the neighbors who are related to you and the neighbors who are not related to you. You have obligations to all of them, and these obligations, again, are ones that go beyond considerations of personal views, religious views, political views, and so forth. They go beyond ethnicity. The Quran at one point talks about how beautiful it is that people speak different languages and are colored differently, have different hues. It's quite a remarkable sentiment for a 7th century book. I don't think most Americans have quite caught up with that one. So the Quran thinks that our diversity, our human diversity of religion, of hue, of language, these are signs of God, and they're beautiful. They're reflecting God's creativity, and they shouldn't be a reason for people to be separated from one another or for people to renounce their obligations to one another. Let me just end by referring to something that Sarah Moch also brought up, which was that the Quran is very much like the Psalms. I teach it sometimes in class, and I've had students come to me and say, well, I can't read it, I can't understand it, I can't get at it. And I say, well, it's not so different from the Psalms. Just think about it that way. And they would look at me sometimes and say, well, I haven't read that one either. A lot of the Quran is praises of God and contemplating how nature tells us about God's greatness and so forth. There are only a few narratives in the Quran of the sort that you have in the Bible. One of the narratives that's given at the greatest length, I think the longest single narrative, is about Joseph, who is called Yusuf in Arabic. But, I've asked myself why. Why is that narrative the one that is retold from the book of Genesis, chapters 37, 39, 40? Why is that story from Genesis the one that is retold at such great length and told quite wonderfully? The Quran's version of the story, and it was common in late antique culture for people to retell these stories. Send me the bill. It was common for people to retell these stories in sermons, for instance. Rabbis or Christian pastors and priests would tell these stories in their sermons to the laity. And it was also common for them to tinker with details. If you get into this literature, you're often quite surprised. They name characters that were unnamed in the Bible, or their various little details are added. And the Quran's rendition of the Joseph story is like that. It has extra details. And there's a wonderful scene where Potiphar's wife, whom Muslims call Zuleika, I don't think in Western culture we never named her. We don't know her name. And in Muslim culture it's the opposite. They don't call the guy Potiphar. But in any case, Potiphar's wife chases Joseph, and she wants to engage in an adulterous affair with him, which is a betrayal of family. And when he won't go along, she falsely accuses him of having initiated these advances when it was actually her. But then people blame her that how did you get yourself in this situation anyway with this Hebrew slave? And she invites the women over to her palace because she's the wife of the kind of top minister of the Pharaoh, and for a banquet. And she brings him out while the women are peeling their fruit. And when they see him, he's so handsome and so impressive that they cut their palms with their fruit knives. And just to underline that, yes, Potiphar's wife was wrong to chase him, but in a way, who could blame her? He was a very attractive man. The other side of the story, of course, is how Joseph got to Egypt in the first place, which was that his half-brothers brought him out to a well, and they were jealous of their father Jacob's love for him, and they sold him off. They threw him in a well and sold him off as a slave to these traveling Egyptians, so he ends up in Egypt. So they betray family. They betrayed the bonds of love and family by doing this to their half-brother, just as Potiphar's wife is betraying the bonds of her family by seeking to have an illicit affair. And what's interesting about the story of Joseph is that, in Greek rhetoric, there are two kinds of stories. There are tragedies and comedies. Comedy doesn't mean what we mean by it nowadays. It's not like stand-up telling jokes. Comedy means that it's a story in which there is a lot of conflict, but at the end of the story, people come back together in a harmonious way. So a lot of Hollywood films are comedies in that sense, that they have a happy ending. Tragedy is one where they don't come back together at the end of the day, and they commit suicide. And Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy. The story of Joseph, both as it is in the Hebrew Bible and as it is in the Quran, is a comedy. It's about how people overcome, in the end, their betrayals of one another and their betrayals of the bonds of family. And why is this being told why is this chapter being recited by the Prophet Muhammad in early 7th century Arabia? I think it's a story about Arabian society. The brothers are the pagan Meccans, some of them uncles and cousins of the Prophet himself, who have turned on him because of his mission and have, metaphorically speaking, thrown him into the well. And what the Quran is saying is to the believers, don't worry. Those are our relatives. We'll continue to deal with them. And the Quran says, at one point it says, repel evil when it's done to you. Repel evil with the greatest good. Al-Asa. And if you do so, even your enemy will be transformed into your devoted patron, somebody who will do favors for you and advance you in life and so forth. And that's, I think, also what the Quran is saying in chapter of Joseph. That yes, our relatives may betray us, our relatives may adopt a point of view on life that we find obnoxious, but by continuing to cultivate the bonds of love and kinship, and even by bringing in the stranger, the traveler, the orphan, the people who we don't know and to whom we're not related, into that sense of kinship and obligation, ultimately we can have a happy ending. Thank you very much.
Yes.